Hello, Psych 101 students, and welcome to Module 2, Learning Objective 7 from Chapter 3. And we'll look at what does it mean to be conscious. So we can begin with the definition of consciousness, the combination of a person's subjective experience of the external world and the person's internal mental activity. So you consciously see and hear things and feel things, that are coming to you from the environment, from the world, and you're conscious, and that's being conscious, and but consciousness is also, being in your own head and having thoughts, and so you experience the external world, and you also experience internal thinking. Early pioneers in psychology were interested in trying to understand consciousness. It was one of the first topics studied when psychology began, and the method that was chosen is known as introspection. And with introspection, they had research participants analyze their personal experiences and describe them to the researcher. They tried to describe what was going on in their consciousness. Um, Wilhelm Wundt uh, was the main researcher that was looking at this, and uh, he wanted to find the building blocks of consciousness. He wanted to, find if there was commonalities um, that that form consciousness, like commonalities between people, that there were certain building blocks that would be shared by people. In particular, when they like observed an object or heard a sound, or or things like that. He would present them with stimuli, and then they would have to give their immediate conscious experience, as soon as they saw something he was holding up, or they heard a certain sound, or they heard music or whatever. And um and and the idea of finding building blocks is kind of like, like if you ask, well, what's a beach made of? Well, it's made of little tiny particles of sand, and a fireplace is made of bricks, and a book is made of pages and word with have words on them, and the words are made up of letters, and it's kind of like, a lot of science tries to look at the smallest units that form to make up something larger, and this is what he's trying to do. He thought there might be units of consciousness that you could describe and that everyone would share. Anyways, this was a failed attempt. We really don't rely on introspection anymore as a method in psychology. And the problem, as it says here, is that it's very subjective. It's unique to each person. So you don't get common conscious consciousness experiences between people. So, if I all of a sudden, or not me, but let's say there's two people that all of a sudden observe the exact same dog at the same time. I mean, one of them might have the subjective conscious experience of feeling afraid, maybe, and the other one is feeling love as soon as he sees this dog. And because each person has their own unique histories and upbringings and their own genes, and so we don't have common consciousness experiences. So as it says here, each person's conscious experience is subjective and unique. Each person brings a unique way of perceiving things, and this was the problem with introspection. You can't build a science upon each person's subjective thoughts, because they're too different from one person to another often. So it's important to understand this difference between objective and subjective. So when when you know you when something is objective, it is something that exists like a fact that doesn't depend on your opinion at all. So, for instance, an objective statement might be that the sky is blue, and we all agree on that. A subjective, uh, when something is subjective, it's your own personal opinion or your own belief. So, I'm, I might put out there that blue is the best color. Obviously, not everyone's going to share that, and that's the problem with subjective opinions. I mean, you once again, this is not something you can build a science around. It's if something is subjective, it's your own thinking based on your own history of living and your own conceptions, your own genetics, and um, what we do in science, obviously, as I talked about in the first module, is that we look for objective truth. Okay, let's go on. Because of the very nature of consciousness, conscious experiences differ from person to person. Once again, they're subjective. We each have a unique pattern of brain connections. No two brains are, exactly the same. So our consciousness is subjective to each of us with our unique brains. What's in your conscious mind is all your own, and it's unique to you individually. Um, we can we can experience a shift in consciousness and in a really simple way. So right now you might be thinking about what I'm talking about, or thinking about this topic of consciousness. Suppose I ask you what you ate for lunch yesterday, like this person's thinking about in the picture here. So all of a sudden I'm directing you, like, yeah, think back to yesterday. Do you remember something you ate for lunch or for dinner or for breakfast, whatever? Well, at first you were unconscious of that information. You weren't thinking about what you ate for lunch yesterday, when I started talking to you. And now I've asked you to think about it, and you would experience what's called a shift in consciousness, something that was not conscious in your mind. That maybe you had, I don't know, pizza for lunch yesterday. Like all of a sudden it came into your mind, and so as you become aware of something new or something remembered, I mean, you become conscious of that information. So our consciousness is really like it describes like what's in your head right now. What is immediately what you're thinking about at any moment. And and we know a lot more than that. Like we have tons of facts and tons of people's names and tons of memories stored in our brains, but most of them we're not conscious of. And so as you pull these memories or these facts back into your mind, you become conscious of them. So that's kind of known as a shift of consciousness. You constantly are shifting your consciousness as you think about new things throughout the day. And we're going to talk about levels of consciousness and also states of consciousness on these next two slides. So, and there's a little bit of overlap between them. But I guess try to keep them straight. But level of consciousness is about being conscious or unconscious. And here, this word unconscious, we don't mean like you've been in an accident and knocked unconscious. I mean, unconscious is like a lack of awareness. So we can define consciousness as awareness of the external world and inner mental activity. Unconsciousness is lack of awareness of the external world and inner mental activity. And so at any particular moment you might be conscious, that is, aware of stimuli around you and aware of your thoughts. At any other moment you might be less aware or unconscious of that same information, just like that lunch example. You were unconscious of what you ate for lunch yesterday until I asked you to think about it, and then you became conscious of it. So these are known as levels of consciousness. So as an example, think about, have you ever been daydreaming while you're reading, let's say reading the textbook, and then you realize you had no idea what you just read. Well, in that example, you were going through the motions of reading, but you were essentially unconscious or unaware of what you read. So so to be conscious, as far as being at the conscious level of awareness, you need to be like, actively attending to something. It has to be like it's actually something that's going through your mind that you're thinking of. You're not just like, so just reading words that you don't actually think about at all, like that would not be conscious awareness. And so, as you might guess, I mean, this idea of conscious versus unconscious is really about attention. It's connected to the idea of attention. When you attend to something, you're conscious of it. If you're not attending to it, you lack awareness or you're unconscious to that thing. Okay, states of consciousness are these two things here. Normal waking state versus altered state of consciousness. So I'm going to start by just reading what's here. So a normal waking state of consciousness is a state of consciousness that reflects a clear awareness of the external world and inner mental activity. It's kind of like a normal state. Like if you're in a normal wakeful state and thinking about, I don't know, maybe you're thinking about this lecture and taking notes, or you're in a normal waking state of consciousness. An altered state of consciousness is a state that deviates from the normal waking state of consciousness. So it may reflect either a more vivid awareness or a less clear awareness of the external world and inner mental activity. So your consciousness has been messed up in one way or another. Um, and I'll get to how that might happen. I'll give you some examples in a moment. So let's say that you're once again you're watching this video lecture and you're paying attention and you're taking notes, in a normal waking state of consciousness. Yet, let's say you know, during one of the lectures that you were watching, you had a cold and you're taking some cold medicine. I mean, you might be struggling to stay awake. It makes you drowsy, perhaps. That would be an altered state of consciousness, just being drowsy because of some kind of medication you took. You're not at your normal wakeful state. So ways that we experience altered states of consciousness. Well, if you have a concussion, maybe you got a blow to the head playing football, for instance, like Iron Mike. If you have a traumatic brain injury, or you're in a coma, these are all different types of altered states of consciousness. Daydreaming is an altered state. Falling asleep is an altered state. Dreaming while asleep would be a different altered state. Watching TV is often an altered state of consciousness because you're focused on one particular thing and you're not in your normal thinking state. Hypnosis, meditation, a concept called flow. A lot of people aren't aware of that. Flow is when you're heavily concentrating on some challenging activity that you're interested in, and time just slips by because you're just so involved in it that hours might slip by, and and because you're just not aware of anything else going on except what you're working on. Um, it might be, it could happen while playing a game. It could happen while, I don't know, maybe you're writing a paper that's really important to you, and that's your whole focus. And anyways, that would be considered, if you're in a state of flow, it would be considered an altered state. And then finally, drugs and alcohol certainly can cause altered states of consciousness. Um, okay. Uh, there, there are two ways to look at how our conscious mind, exists. Um, and these are dualism and materialism. Um, the idea of dualism was put forth in the 1600s, by a philosopher by the name of Rene Descartes. Descartes. It's spelled Descartes, and he wrote about dualism. And I want to point out a mistake. Oh, actually, I've corrected it. Okay, you may have a mistake if you printed out the PowerPoints. The brain and the mind are separate. It used to say inseparable, which was the opposite. But dualism is that the brain, the physical brain, and the your consciousness or your mind that are separate things. Uh, so dualists, they say that uh, minds are not made of physical stuff. And so it's kind of like, it's kind of like the idea of you have your mind or your consciousness is just kind of using your body and your brain, but it exists separately. And anyways, so that was one viewpoint put forth once again back in the 1600s. The more modern view is known as materialism, and this is that the processing of the brain allows for the experiences of the mind, that we get consciousness because of how our brain works, how our physical brain works, and you can't have a mind or consciousness without the brain. um what else here? So the process of the brain like creates the experience of mind. And materialists, you know they they have the viewpoint that the world is entirely physical. You know, um, you don't have a mind that can exist without a body and a brain. Um, and this would rule out things like spirits or ghosts or even like maybe the soul. Would a strict materialist would probably say, yeah, that can't exist. I mean, it's the idea that things are everything is physical in nature, and and our consciousness doesn't float around on its own. It's produced your by your brain, by your physical brain. Okay. Psychologists examine and even measure consciousness and other mental states that were once considered too subjective to be studied. Psychology is beginning to reveal how brain activity may give rise to specific subjective experiences. So, although we can't examine or measure your consciousness directly, now with newer technology, we can examine and measure and cause changes to your brain, and which is what causes your consciousness. So, indirectly, now we are studying consciousness and mental states because we can do things like temporarily excite part of a person's brain, or we can actually turn off part of their brain. And these are experimental methods that are being used to alter a person's temporarily alter a person's thinking or their conscious experience. So we have a way now of showing that if we change the physical brain, it's going to change your consciousness, and that lends support obviously to the materialism view that it is the brain that creates consciousness. Uh, consci- Consciousness is a product of activity in specific brain regions. The key idea of what's called the global workspace model is that no single area of the brain is responsible for general awareness. So it's what this model says is that conscious awareness of different aspects of the world is associated with processing in different parts of the brain. So, like, my conscious experience right now is not located in any one part of my brain. What you're experiencing at this moment doesn't, you can't find it in one spot. So, because right now you're hearing things, and we know that's coming from your temporal lobe. And if you're looking at the screen, that's coming from your occipital lobe. And I don't know if you're moving about, that's coming from your primary motor cortex, and so on. If you're planning, or you're making decisions about what notes to take, that's coming from your prefrontal cortex. And this is the way consciousness is. It's a collection of a whole bunch of different types of awareness. I'm aware of sounds I'm hearing. I'm aware of my vision. I'm aware of my movements. I'm aware of where I am in space. Like I'm sitting on a chair now. I'm aware of what I'm thinking about doing. And these all kind of combine to give you one experience of of consciousness of and so we kind of think of it as one thing. Like I was sitting in my office, making a video lecture, and the birds were chirping outside. Like, but we don't break it apart when we talk about our experiences. But really, it's a whole bunch of little separate types of awarenesses that we just kind of integrate, and they're all coming from different parts of the brain. And this is what the global workspace model says. Okay, so that brings us to looking at some altered states of consciousness, and this is one of the examples I mentioned earlier: traumatic brain injury, or TBI. It's a change in consciousness caused by brain damage, and one of the things that causes TBI is severe concussions, and this is what happened to Iron Mike Webster. He suffered from a traumatic brain injury due to his multiple concussions that he had during his football career. And it was his example and others like him that finally led to investigations into football and other sports as well. But the NFL ended up making rule changes for in order to try to minimize concussions, and in every sport now we have concussion spotters that can take a player off, if they believe that he or she suffered a concussion, because we now realize that there are long-term effects of concussions. As it says here, one of them is increased risk of multiple sclerosis for adolescents who experience concussions. Females are more vulnerable to concussions and have worse outcomes than males. Here we see an example in this picture of what can be a dangerous sport, cheerleading, with all the flipping around and stuff. Concussions do certainly happen in this sport. I'm going to give you a whole list here of symptoms of traumatic brain injury. Um, Here they go: headaches, dizziness, extreme mood swings. For instance, being quick to anger, like Iron Mike became. Overall changes in mood, including anxiety and depression, changes in behavior, like somebody starting to drink more, or increase drug use or something like that. Changes in thinking, difficulty reading, memory problems, mental confusion. Remember in the Iron Mike example, that the tangled fishing wire, like his thoughts were like that. And in some cases, unconsciousness may result in possibly death. But one of the problems with concussions is that often the person may look on the surface, they look fine because you often can't see any physical symptoms. Like, this is why when they think somebody might have a concussion, they have trained doctors that will ask them certain questions and have a conversation with them to check out to see if their thinking is okay, because the damage is being done in the brain. The brain bounces around, against the skull during a concussion, and the brain can get bruised and damaged due to blows to the head. And so, if somebody was always knocked unconscious, we'd know it was serious right away. But this was the problem with concussions, is that often, you couldn't see any physical symptoms from a concussion. Okay, so this one type of altered state of consciousness. Another is coma. Some people with a traumatic brain injury may enter into a coma state. People in comas do have sleep-wake cycles. Many people don't know this. They open their eyes, they appear to be awake, but generally they do not respond to their surroundings. So if somebody's in a coma and opens their eyes, it sometimes freaks people out, I think, but it doesn't mean that they're aware at all. Brain imaging has shown that some people in comas are in what's called a minimally conscious state. They're able to understand language and mental activity, but they cannot make their bodies respond. So it's like they're laying there in a coma, but they actually show changes in their brain when due to the speech around them and people talk to them and things like that. Let's look at an example, and then I'll come back to the slide. So on the next slide, we see this example of a study that was done looking where we were looking at a person in a minimally conscious state. So the brain images at the top are from a patient who was a young woman, and she was in a coma and showed no visible signs of consciousness. So she was laying there, definitely in a coma. The images at the bottom are from are a composite from the control group. A composite means like they had a number of control subjects that participated, and then they kind of put the results together to kind of get like an average. So the control group were normal, healthy volunteers, and what they were being scanned with an fMRI while they were given instructions on what to think about. So on the left side, they were asked to visualize playing tennis. And remember, the top patient's in a coma, and you can see that the similarity between the coma patient, the activity, and the healthy volunteers. So when told to visualize tennis, the activity was in the same region of the brain. I mean, it's not going to be an exact match, but same region of the brain as the healthy controls. This meant that the person was responding to that that voice, that suggestion, visualize playing tennis. And on the right, we see the example where they were told to visualize walking around, or what's called spatial navigation. It's not quite as good of a match, but it's close enough. It, it's not. It's close enough that it's not random. So the similarity between the coma patient and the healthy controls suggests that the coma patient was in a minimally conscious state, where she actually was conscious on some level because she was responding to these I was going to say commands, but to these suggestions on what to think about. So responding to somebody talking to her. And so that's not what we think of that's not what we used to think of normally with comas. And so this was kind of a huge discovery that we've been able to find using this our newer scanning technology. Without that scanning technology, there'd be no way to ever know whether the person can hear you or have any awareness at all. One study that started to look at this, they looked at 54 coma patients, and they found that 5 of them could control their brain activity. When they were given suggestions, their brain activity changed to when they were told what to think about. So that's about 1 out of every 11, that had that were in a minimally conscious state. So I find that kind of interesting. I wonder, we don't know how conscious are they. Is it just kind of reflexive that their brain starts to think about what you told it to, or are they actually in there saying I can't move, I can't open, I can't talk, I can't open my eyes. I wonder how conscious they are, but they follow, they're able to follow directions on what to think about. So kind of interesting. This is back one slide again, just to finish up the previous slide. So when a coma lasts more than a month, The person is said to have unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And I'm going to talk about an example. And some of you older students may remember this example um, from a couple of decades ago. And it was in the news a lot. Anyways, this is the example of Terri Schiavo. This woman, she spent more than 15 years with unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. This was from 1990. She was when she first entered into coma state, and until she finally died in 2005. Um, her husband wanted to terminate life support, but her parents battled him in court. It was a huge deal, and a lot of ethical issues. So, after the court ruled in the husband's favor, Scheivel's autopsy revealed substantial and irreversible damage throughout her brain. Um, by the way, I'm skipping over some of the details, but she was on a feeding tube, and at one point, you know, it was removed, and then there was a cord injunction, and it was put back in. Then it got removed again, and then there was you know, another cord that's in there had to be put back. So it actually, the feeding tube got removed, total of 3 times. Like twice it had to be put back because they were battling out in court, and it actually this made it all the way to the Supreme Court because her husband felt that her wishes would have been to not just keep laying there and after 15 years, to just kind of die peacefully. And her parents were convinced that she could still, I guess, wake up. But I can understand being a parent. You would cling to anything, and especially as I mentioned, they thought they saw signs of awareness at times. Could probably she opened their eyes at times and things like that. Just to continue with this example, going ahead a couple slides. Um, let me find my notes here. Okay, here we go. Yeah. So before Terri Schiavo was taken off life support, her parents and their supporters believed, as I was saying, that she showed some awareness, but the dark areas of her brain scan uh, over on the left side here indicate that her cortex had deteriorated beyond recovery. On the right is an example of an undamaged brain, and based on these scans, there could not have been activity in any of these areas that are dark, and there is no, every doctor that examined this concluded that she could not have been in any state of consciousness or awareness, and would never regain consciousness. So once again, this is unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. Has to be at least a month. Terri Schiavo was in this unresponsive wakefulness state for 15 years. Okay. Attention and consciousness in the two-track mind. I remember one of the items on the discussion board coming up this week asks about this very topic. And let's go through it. Attention is the focusing of mental resources on specific information to become consciously aware of that information. As I was talking about earlier, attention determines what is in your consciousness at any moment. And you can always shift your attention from one thing to another. But so this is why that's just a little aside. You don't need to write this down, but because we're not covering it. But William James was an early American psychologist. He's the one that came up with the term stream of consciousness. He said it's like a stream, like a flowing stream, because it never stands still. You can't examine consciousness as like a picture, like where it's like stagnant or still, because your thoughts are always moving. Like you can be concentrated on one thing for a while, but still you have a constant flow of thoughts and thinking going on. It is always moving. Anyway, so once again, this is because of our attention. We constantly shifting our attention, and even internally, even if your eyes are closed and you're just daydreaming, like, you're still, there's something going on, like you're moving from one thing to another in your thoughts. And so we have like an internal attention if we're just within our own head, or we have an external attention in what we're looking at or listening to in the world around us. Attention involves both automatic processing and controlled processing. Let me go to the next slide to continue this. Automatic processing is fast and does not require a lot of mental resources. And it is certainly so. Automatic processing is something that requires less attention, but it also leads to less awareness. An example is in this top picture here. An experienced driver driving in good conditions will often, especially if it's a long road trip or something, they'll often let their mind wander. They're in, like, I was, I recently drove to Ohio, and I was driving through the night. And it was like 2 in the morning till 6 in the morning. I was driving, and it was great. I was having all sorts of interesting thoughts along the way about things, and because the drive was so easy, I like driving in the dark, and there was so little traffic that you just have to keep it in the lane, and it was all expressway driving, or interstate driving, and so I didn't have to look for any directions. I knew exactly where I was going, and it's you can sometimes experience something called highway hypnosis, where you just use a little part of your brain to do the driving, and the rest of your brain can kind of go off and think about other things. No, so that's automatic processing. The driving is so easy, and it like something. Once again, you have to be a very experienced driver to count on this, but it's so easy, and that you only need a little part of your brain to kind of monitor that task. Um, but once again, you do have less awareness. It does increase the chance of maybe making a mistake or missing something. Controlled processing, on the other hand, is slow, and it requires more mental resources. It requires more attention, certainly, and it and it but that and that more attention leads to greater awareness. And this would be the case in bad conditions. Even if you're an experienced driver, and and this happened on that trip as well. So I was cruising along in my kind of hypnotic state. It was so easy. And then I got to this whole construction zone in through Pennsylvania, where it got down to one lane, and there were trucks on the road, and they were really thin lanes, and it wasn't like terrible conditions, but I certainly had to snap my mind back, because there were some twists and turns because of the construction, and so you start clutching the wheel a little bit more. You really focus your attention forward, so you can shift from automatic to controlled processing depending on the circumstances. Um, and it's certainly in bad conditions like rain or snow. I mean, you really should be doing controlled processing. You should not be letting your mind wander at all. It's and we can do that. Like we can purposely focus our attention when we need to. Okay. This this distinction between automatic and controlled processing, what what we call the two-track mind on the previous slide. It was just to show you, attention, consciousness in the two-track mind. It's been given that name. This distinction was pointed out or made by a guy named Daniel Kahneman. I'm going to spell his name just in case you are interested. It's K-A-H. You won't be tested though. Kahneman. Kahneman, or no, just no S. Okay. Kahneman. And his name Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman. He wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and it was all about this kind of. He was talking about automatic versus controlled processing. It was back in 2011. It was published, and it was actually a mega bestseller. Very good book. Um, so that is the two track mind. Uh, yeah. Okay, let's go on. Oh, wrong way. But let me point out the danger of distracted driving. Um, Once again, to engage in automatic processing, you have to be very experienced at anything that you do. Talking and texting on a mobile phone while driving is dangerous. It is something I never do. Um, a driver's performance is still impaired, even if they're using a hands-free device, because once again, it's an attention issue. It's not, it doesn't matter. You're not in danger because you're holding the phone. That doesn't help, but that doesn't cause the danger. The danger is that you're distracted. So even the use of intelligent personal assistants like Siri or Google Assistants still causes distraction and impairs driving. It's really just, I'll just say my piece here. It's what's so important that we can't stop somewhere or like wait a few minutes, or this is what I do. My phone rings. I just don't bother. I mean, I just, there's nothing that's, so important that I can't wait till my next stop, or I can't pull over somewhere to have a conversation with somebody. I mean, like, does life have to be that fast that we're constantly multitasking? So I just think that talking on the phone while driving is just a stupid behavior. And I think I could probably do a fine. I'm a very experienced driver, a very safe driver, but I'm not even gonna bother risking it because it's not important to me. It's not that important to have conversations on the phone while I'm driving. Okay, anyways, that's just my piece. Don't do it, please. Be a leader that shows a better way for you, for your peers, and for people that might be younger than you or look up to you. Okay, that brings us to multitasking, which is, I guess, which is a nice follow because you're certainly multitasking if you're driving and talking on the phone. Um, with multitasking, your attention can be divided, but divided attention is limited. Um, Frequent multitasking by children and young adults has been linked to the following: an inability to focus attention on a single task for more than a few minutes. Um, a lot of people believe that newer generations have more limited focused attention because of the amount of multitasking that goes on. It's also been linked to poor school performance, feelings of anxiety and depression, obesity, and sleep problems. All right, let's go on. Limited attention affects consciousness. So imagine if the person you were talking to suddenly changed into another person. Would you notice? Well, most people are going to say yes, of course. Like, I mean, for one moment, you didn't see them, and then there was somebody else. Like, would you always notice if it's a person you had never met before, you start talking to them, and then something blocks your view of them, and then all of a sudden it's a new person. Well, once again, most people say, of course, if I'm talking to somebody else, I would know if they changed. Well, this was tested in a famous psychology experiment by Simons and Levin, published in 1998. They demonstrated the phenomenon known as inattentional blindness, a failure to be aware of visual information when one's attention is directed elsewhere. And this is, you know, a setup of the experiment here. Um, I'll zoom in here. Okay. So the hypothesis was if their attention is distracted, people can be blind to visual information of which they are not consciously aware. So this is the way they did the study. A participant is approached by a stranger. So this is the participant here and with the white hair, and this guy comes up and he asks for directions. And so the guy on the sidewalk with the white hair starts giving him directions. All of a sudden, these people say, "Oh, excuse me." They're carrying this large. It's like a large painting or something like that. But there's two people carrying it, and they just kind of pass in between them, and they switch the person. So the guy that he was talking to, ends up carrying going behind the wood, this wooden board, and a new guy comes out. And you'd think, you'd think that most people would think that they would notice. But what were the results? Half of the participants given directions never noticed they were talking to a different person, as long as the replacement was of the same race and sex as the original stranger. Yeah, if it goes from a man to a woman, or if it goes from I don't know, a dark skinned person to a light skinned person, maybe you'll probably notice that. But you they actually, it turns out you can get away with some significant changes. These guys in these pictures, they do look pretty similar, but they don't even have to be that similar um, in order to fool people. And so the conclusion was inattentional blindness results from a lack of conscious awareness of certain visual information. Once again, going back to the idea of attention, you've just been asked to give directions. This was done, I believe, on a campus. And so it's like, how do I get to the library? So, you start thinking about the best way to send them. You start describing, oh, you've got to walk through this building over here. And the person ends up switching. Well, your attention was on the directions. And even though you did see the person, but you did not attend to them. So we don't store everything we see. We don't store everything we hear. So this showed this new concept. It was a new concept at the time, inattentional blindness, and it's been demonstrated many times since. And I've included a video. It'll be after this video in the list. It's a recreation of the original experiment. It's called Darren Brown Person Swap. Take a look at it. It's not that long, and you'll see examples of this happening. And that will conclude learning objective 7.